What you describe is a pretty comprehensive approach, a sort of human rights for the whole person. But in the poorest countries, couldn't they be construed as a luxury that they simply can't afford? Or
that's what they said to the president of Sierra Leone.
Okay.
You can't afford to do this. And he said, no, I can. I'm the president and I'm going to do it. And there's a painful, and actually one of his problems is the problem that this country takes health workers from Sierra Leone and from other countries in Africa and gives them a right as individuals to a career which is good for the individual, but actually it's a kind of development gift to the modern Ireland and the United States that we can take fully qualified doctors or nurses from the poorest countries and give them individually an opportunity, but not realize that we're undermining the strengthening of health systems in those countries. Realizing Rights greatly supported a code of conduct last May in the World Health Assembly, a code of practice about not recruiting aggressively from the poorest countries and having now ethical policies. If you recruit, shouldn't you be paying for the education of twice as many in those countries? And I think we need to move in that direction.
But it's an interesting case because it's a perfect example of what happens in a globalized workforce.
Yeah.
There's now a globalized workforce for nurses, which there wasn't all that long ago. Has globalization been a friend of those hundreds of millions who are seeking to have their human rights recognized, not only by their governments, but by their employers, by people half a world away?
There is a globalization of nursing, as you say. There are actually fast-track visas for nurses to encourage them to come as individuals. Again, not realizing many of the nurses come from the Philippines, which is a particular policy, and there's maybe a slightly different case because there's a certain training for career opportunities of nurses in the Philippines, and they, by going abroad, support and send remittances back. But for many poor African countries, the drain out of doctors and nurses is very negative. But they got the fast-track visas to come in. What about the undocumented migrants? I have to say that in my 8 years here in New York, I said nice things earlier about, and I mean them, about really enjoying being in New York, and there's wonderful things about this city and this country. But I have noticed a hardening of attitudes towards what are called illegal aliens. I know it's a language that many of you are so used to, you don't analyze it. For me, the two words are so negative about human beings that the combination of them is entirely derogatory, illegal and alien. I frankly don't believe that you should ever use those two words for a human being. Language matters. We can say undocumented migrants. We fought a long campaign in Ireland that no child should ever be called illegitimate, and it mattered when we changed the law. And no child in Ireland is called illegitimate. It's not just the United States. The United States used to be a country with a very good policy towards migrants because you are a country that has benefited hugely from inward migration. Europe is now copying all the worst examples, and Europe is becoming very nationalist in a very narrow way. Yet, if you look sensibly at this subject, we do need the migrants. And I hope that maybe if there was a more sort of positive attitude toward those migrants that do receive the fast-track visas. In other words, if the United States would think about the doctors and nurses from the poorest countries that are coming into the United States as being a development gain for the United States, which means that there should be a give back through development aid by the United States to those countries. There are about 10 countries that the United States draws doctors and nurses from. Why not subsidize and support medical training and nurse training in those countries? And then you realize the interdependence. And then you begin to realize the interdependence of other migrants. And maybe we will have a more humane, more human approach to the issue of migration. It's become so negative and so, because partly of the language and partly of the way it's described.
If you and I went to, I don't know, Filene's basement somewhere in a major American city, we'd find undershirts from Honduras, men's shirts from Sri Lanka, women's blouses from Mauritius, dresses and outer garments sewn in Lesotho, of all places, as the worldwide garment industry races to the bottom looking for the cheapest possible workforce. On one level, you might say, oh, well, that's great. It's bringing employment and opportunity to people who had neither for a long time. But I also wonder if we're doing these people any favor by sort of bringing them into the global swirl of hiring halls and factory work and so on, and whether that kind of globalization will force us to think hard about what it means to have rights as a worker.
Well, certainly what you describe rightly, I think, as the race to the bottom is a real problem. And it's a real problem in the long supply chains of quite well-known brands, to realize that if goods are made very cheaply, it's more than likely that human rights are being abused, that the workers there don't have proper health and safety, they don't have proper working conditions, very often it's women workers, etc. And it is a big problem for even well-known companies, even companies that belong to the Business and Human Rights Initiative that I had the honour to be honorary chair of. The GAP, which joined the Business Leaders Initiative on Human Rights, said at the time, we can never guarantee that there will not be problems in our supply chain. We have to constantly monitor it, and there have been problems. And it's a kind of honesty about that that's important. It's also why the Resource Centre on Business and Human Rights is playing such a valuable role. It's Chris Avery and his colleagues that we saw on the film in different parts of the world who are tracking what is happening, and that this race to the bottom, which is in fact being prepared to have a supply chain that allows for very abusive conditions of work. And it's the other end from what I was talking earlier about Liberia, about a Ministry of Labour which is actually committing to decent work standards in the country, even though there are some advisors like World Bank who say Liberia can't afford this.
Well, that's exactly it. Doesn't this set up a tension, and a permanent tension, between the ministers of labor and health, who don't want their own citizens to be abused by global capital, but at the same time want their people to have work and a steady paycheck, and at the same time don't want to advocate that the wage scales rise. Because if the wage scales of their own people rise, that will make them uncompetitive with people half a world away suddenly. So while you might want your people to get paid more, getting them paid more is dangerous at the very same moment.
Well, that I think is an approach that we need to examine, certainly from a human rights perspective. I think that the Respect, Protect, Remedy framework will be helpful, because corporations will have to respect all human rights, and that means labour conditions. And one of the ways in which we'll try to, when I say enforce this, try to hold companies accountable will be precisely the visibility in websites like the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre and the work of the Institute for Business and Human Rights in looking at dilemmas of this kind. It's good that a number of social investors are now looking at investments of companies and are saying, and are looking at supply chain issues. They're very, and are looking at particular sectors. The Fair Trade, Fair Labour Association are looking at particularly supply chain issues in a number of countries. And I think we'll continue to fight this fight. What people sometimes forget is that work itself is a human right under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this tendency of workless growth is something that we need to look at, and high unemployment in countries because we've put all the emphasis on large profit and all the incentives on that side. I think that more and more this agenda will have to shift to understanding that core labor standards are part of human rights and we have to respect them. And any company that's involved with a supply chain that dips below that in this race to the bottom has reputational problems. And I mean Chinese companies and other companies, as they trade internationally, will have to be very vigilant about their working conditions, because more and more these are going to become transparent.
Well, does it matter why a company complies with those sort of standards? Do you get a different kind of compliance from a company that wants to do the right thing and for the right reasons versus one that just wants to make a public relations problem go away?
Well, it may not be exactly the question you've asked, but it's kind of something that I was intrigued about with the experience over the 6 years of the Business Leaders Initiative on Human Rights, the different companies that were involved, because initially it was for 3 years. And I was quite surprised that the companies that were already involved, which is about 8 or 9 companies, and then we were joined by others like GE and Coca-Cola and Hewlett-Packard and others, because they wanted themselves in a structured way to engage positively in what are the human rights responsibilities of our company, how do we deal with them. But what they found was it motivated their employees. They actually had gains in assessing risk, in a sense that the company was ahead of the curve in the way it needed to go. So as we heard from Chris earlier, for businesses that take human rights seriously, it becomes a business gain. It becomes something that is part of the reputation of the company. So I would hope that this will increasingly become more of a norm under the new framework that John Ruggie has been putting forward and the guiding principles that he's working on.
Earlier in your talk, you said governments still matter. And John Ruggie mentioned the World Economic Forum, and when I was a media fellow at the World Economic Forum, I attended several conferences where there was an almost triumphalist spirit in the streets of Davos that governments really didn't matter that much anymore. That what we were looking at was a 21st century where corporations and their relationships with each other were going to be really the straw that stirs the drink, globally speaking. What happened?
Well, when the financial crisis hit, governments mattered. They had to bail out the banks, you know? It suddenly mattered. But, no, I know at the moment there's quite an election being fought on that issue here in this country. And I suppose I'm more influenced by a more European tradition in a way. But I think profoundly governments do matter, especially in the area of values, in the area of broader equity and fairness in the country. One of the things that troubles me about this great country is, in fact, the inequalities in wealth. Even when very wealthy people found foundations and do some give back, etc., it isn't going to compensate for the fact that at the moment the divides are inequitable, and there are social consequences of that. And I think those social consequences will play out over time unless basically the taxation system becomes fairer.